Betrayal arrived the moment I realized my boss understood every German word my wife whispered about her pregnancy, and chose to use it against me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam a door. I didn't demand explanations. I felt something colder than anger settle in my chest, something precise and patient, because in that instant I understood two things at once. I had been listened to without consent, and I had been judged without courage. When power hides behind a smile, the only way through is clarity. I am telling this the way an older man tells it, not to impress, not to accuse, but to explain how silence can move faster than shouting. What happened to me unfolded in an ordinary American suburb, in an ordinary office with glass walls and polite greetings. That's where people forget that betrayal doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a tie. My wife and I had agreed on one simple rule. We would protect our private moments until we were ready. The pregnancy was early. Fragile. Ours. At work, she sat 2 floors above me, on a team that answered to the same director. She spoke German to feel safe, to keep joy from leaking into a place that had never been kind to vulnerability. We believed privacy was a right. We were wrong. That morning, the air in the building felt heavier than usual. I noticed it first in the elevator. People avoided eye contact. A few smiled too quickly. It's strange how your body knows before your mind catches up. I stepped out on my floor with a quiet confidence that came from years of steady work. I had delivered results. I had trained people who outranked me. I had saved projects no one remembers now. I believed that counted. It didn't. My manager called me into a meeting without a calendar invite. No agenda. No notes. Just a glass room and a director seated at the far end, hands folded, face carefully neutral. I took my seat and waited. Silence can be a test. I let them hold it. They spoke about alignment, about flexibility, about future planning, words that pretend to mean something while hiding the blade. Then the director said a sentence that didn't belong in the room. He mentioned timing. He mentioned reliability. He mentioned concerns that arrive when people have personal changes. I asked him to be clear. He smiled and said he already was. That was when I understood. The German. The whispers. The confidence they felt listening without permission. The assumption that I would shrink, that I would explain myself, that I would apologize for a life event they had no right to know. The betrayal wasn't just the listening. It was the calculation that followed. I thanked them for their honesty. They expected a reaction. They didn't get one. I left the room the same way I entered it, with my back straight and my thoughts quiet. On my desk, my phone vibrated. A message from my wife. One line. Did something change? I typed back slowly. Yes. But we will handle it. You learn a lot in the seconds after betrayal. You learn who panics. You learn who performs. And you learn whether you are willing to play a long game. I had learned the long game early in life, not because I wanted to, but because impatience had cost me once before. This time, I chose patience. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't hint. I didn't complain. I did something quieter. I listened. When people believe you are unaware, they reveal themselves. Meetings grew strangely specific. Decisions shifted without documentation. Jokes landed too close to home. The director liked to demonstrate his cleverness. He assumed languages were costumes he could put on when it suited him. I decided not to correct that assumption yet. At home, my wife watched me carefully. She knew my silences. She knew the difference between calm and stillness before movement. I told her the truth without drama. I told her I would not fight in public. I told her I would answer in a language they understood. She asked if I was afraid. I said no, because fear is loud. And I was very quiet. In the days that followed, I documented everything. Dates. Phrases. The way policies were applied differently depending on who was listening. I wrote nothing emotional. Facts only. Patterns matter more than stories when you want justice without noise. The director scheduled another meeting. This time, he brought coffee. A friendly gesture meant to soften the edge. He asked how I was feeling. I told him I was grateful for transparency. He nodded, relieved. People relax when they think the danger has passed. He asked about my wife. I answered in German. Not a performance. Not a flourish. Just a sentence, clean and calm, acknowledging concern while setting a boundary. His eyes flickered. Just once. Enough. I watched him realize something he hadn't considered. Listening works both ways. I didn't press. I didn't smile. I let the moment stand and then returned to English as if nothing had happened. The meeting ended early. Power dislikes mirrors. From that day on, the tone changed. Emails grew careful. Conversations gained witnesses. The director began to avoid specifics. He had understood the message without needing it explained. This is where most people expect fireworks. They expect confrontation. They expect a public reckoning. That's not how quiet revenge works. Quiet revenge is not about pain. It's about precision. I kept working. I exceeded targets. I made myself useful in ways that required documentation. I shared credit loudly and corrections privately. I became impossible to remove without explanation. At the same time, I prepared for an outcome that didn't depend on them. Because real leverage is choice. I updated my records. I spoke to no one about it. I waited. Betrayal teaches you where the lines are. Wisdom teaches you how to redraw them. This was only the beginning. The betrayal deepened when I realized they weren't just listening. They were planning my future without me. After that meeting, nothing looked different on the surface. Desks stayed where they were. Calendars filled the same way. People laughed in the break room and complained about traffic like always. But once you see behind the curtain, you never forget the shape of the ropes. I paid attention to small shifts. My projects were suddenly discussed without me present. Decisions arrived already finalized. Feedback that once came directly now traveled through careful emails, written as if they expected to read them aloud one day. When people prepare for defense, it means they know they crossed a line. My wife noticed it too. She said her manager had started asking questions that sounded harmless but felt invasive. Questions about timelines, about energy, about priorities, all framed as concern, all sharpened with implication. She answered politely, in German, controlled. She had learned from me without me needing to teach. At night, we spoke quietly, not because we were afraid, but because we were thinking. Strategy needs space. Emotion needs air. We gave each other both. I told her something I learned a long time ago. When someone misuses power, they believe speed will protect them. They rush. They assume silence is weakness. They forget that silence can observe. At work, the director began performing confidence. He spoke more in meetings. He repeated points that didn't need repeating. He liked to hear his own certainty echo off glass walls. The more he talked, the more patterns emerged. He favored people who mirrored him. He sidelined people who questioned timing or ethics. He wrapped decisions in policy language and called it leadership. One afternoon, an internal reorganization was announced. It sounded neutral, necessary, efficient. My role would shift. Less visibility. Fewer strategic decisions. Still employed. Still smiling. That's how quiet removals are done. No firing. Just erosion. I thanked them for the update. That confused them. Confusion is useful. It makes people careless. I began asking questions in writing. Simple ones. Clarifications. Alignment checks. Nothing accusatory. Every answer added another line to the record. I wasn't building a case. I was building clarity. A colleague warned me quietly that I should be careful. He meant well. I told him I was. He didn't understand what I meant. Careful doesn't always mean cautious. Sometimes it means exact. The director requested another private conversation. He framed it as support. He wanted to know how I felt about the changes. I said I understood the business needs. I said flexibility mattered. I said stability was important for teams. All true. All neutral. Then I paused. Pauses unsettle people more than arguments. He filled the silence by explaining himself. He talked about long-term planning, about risks, about how leadership has to consider future constraints. I listened until he ran out of certainty. Then I said one sentence, in German, about respect. Not loud, not sharp, just precise. He asked me to repeat it. I switched back to English and summarized politely. The message stayed intact. The language changed. His smile tightened. He ended the meeting quickly. After that, I was no longer invisible. I was something else. Watched. Being watched is not dangerous if you know it's happening. It only becomes dangerous when you forget. I didn't forget. I documented changes. I saved drafts. I noticed who stopped copying whom. I noticed when legal language appeared where it hadn't before. At home, my wife asked if this was worth it. I told her the truth. This wasn't about winning. It was about not shrinking. Quiet revenge is not about damage. It's about dignity. She told me she trusted me. That mattered more than any title. Weeks passed. The pressure became subtle but constant. Deadlines tightened. Expectations blurred. Praise disappeared. Criticism arrived indirectly. They wanted me tired. People make mistakes when they're tired. I rested instead. I delegated better. I stopped volunteering explanations. I delivered exactly what was asked for. Nothing more. Nothing less. Precision again. Then something interesting happened. A compliance review was announced. Routine, they said. I smiled when I read the email. Routine reviews don't scare honest people. They scare people who assume silence equals safety. The director became cautious. He asked HR to join meetings. He corrected himself mid-sentence. He avoided private rooms. He had understood something important too late. Language leaves traces. Listening creates records. My wife was asked to transfer teams. Presented as an opportunity. She declined politely. In writing. With reasons that referenced policy. Clear. They didn't push. Power often retreats when it meets structure. I received an external call one evening. A recruiter. Unplanned. Interested. Curious. I listened without committing. Options are leverage even when you don't use them. Especially when you don't use them. The next day, the director complimented my recent work publicly. It sounded generous. It was defensive. I thanked him. Still calm. This was no longer about misunderstanding. It was about containment. They were trying to keep the story small. I was letting it stay that way. For now. Quiet revenge requires timing. Too early, and it looks emotional. Too late, and it looks accidental. I was patient. The betrayal that started with listening had grown into something heavier. Control. Assumption. Arrogance. But arrogance makes mistakes. Always. And one mistake was coming. I could feel it in the careful way they spoke. In the sudden interest in policies they once ignored. In the way the director avoided my eyes when German was mentioned casually in conversation. Silence had done its work. The stage was almost set. The danger became real the moment I realized they believed I had no way out. That belief changes how people behave. When someone thinks you're trapped, they stop pretending to be fair. Courtesy fades. Language sharpens. Decisions grow bolder. I saw it in the way meetings were scheduled without notice, and in how outcomes were announced as facts instead of discussions. The director had settled into a new rhythm. He spoke as if the future was already decided. My future. He referenced long-term plans that didn't include me by name, but everyone understood the shape of what he meant. It was removal by atmosphere. No fingerprints. No scene. That's when I knew the hook was complete. Betrayal. Planning. Containment. All neatly wrapped. The only thing missing was their mistake. It arrived quietly. A project I had built from the ground up was reassigned. Officially, it was about efficiency. Unofficially, it was about control. The handover meeting was brief. Too brief. Questions weren't invited. I nodded, took notes, and asked for documentation. They didn't have it. The director assured me it would come later. I said that was fine. I sent a follow-up email summarizing what had been said. Factual. Neutral. Silence followed. Silence is an answer. Later that afternoon, my wife forwarded me a message from her manager. It mentioned workload concerns related to upcoming personal responsibilities. The phrasing was careful. The meaning was not. I read it once. Then again. Then I saved it. That was the moment the story stopped being about me alone. I didn't sleep much that night. Not from fear. From clarity. When lines are crossed openly, patience becomes direction. I made a decision before sunrise. I would not defend myself. I would let the structure speak. The next morning, I requested a formal review of role changes. Standard process. Company policy. Nothing dramatic. HR was included automatically. That changed the temperature immediately. Voices softened. Jokes disappeared. Agendas suddenly mattered. In the meeting, the director explained the reassignments again. He spoke slowly, carefully. He avoided certain words. I let him finish. Then I asked him to clarify one point. I asked in German. Not to surprise. Not to provoke. To be accurate. The room froze. HR didn't understand the words, but they understood the shift. Power hates ambiguity it can't control. The director answered in English, choosing his phrasing with visible effort. I nodded and translated my own question calmly. The record reflected both languages. From that point on, everything changed. Not loudly. Systemically. Follow-up emails came faster. Decisions were deferred. Let's circle back replaced certainty. People who had avoided eye contact now watched closely, measuring which way the wind would turn. At lunch, a senior colleague sat beside me without invitation. He spoke carefully. He said the situation looked complicated. I agreed. He said leadership was under pressure. I agreed again. He asked what I planned to do. I told him the truth. I'm going to do my job. Nothing unsettles power like someone who doesn't negotiate with fear. That afternoon, I received confirmation of the compliance review timeline. Dates. Scope. Names. Real names. The director was copied. He replied with a single line acknowledging receipt. No enthusiasm. No jokes. At home, my wife and I walked after dinner. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. She held my hand and said one thing. They shouldn't have listened. She was right. But more importantly, they shouldn't have assumed silence meant ignorance. This is where the hook ends and the truth begins. Everything up to this point was pressure. What followed would be exposure. Not revenge in the way people imagine it. No collapse. No shouting. Just the slow correction of a story told without consent. I didn't feel anger anymore. Anger burns fuel you might need later. What I felt was focus. Focus sharpens time. They had set events in motion thinking I would react emotionally. They were wrong. I reacted structurally. When the director passed my desk that evening, he paused. He almost spoke. Almost. I looked up and smiled politely. He walked on. That was when I knew something irreversible had begun. Not because I had attacked, but because I hadn't. Betrayal had opened the door. Silence had widened it. Now the consequences would walk in on their own. The injustice was simple. They decided my value the moment they thought my life would slow them down. Before any of this happened, I believed in systems. Not blindly, but respectfully. I believed that if you showed up, did the work, and stayed consistent, the system would at least treat you honestly. That belief wasn't naive. It was earned over years of quiet effort, years where I learned that stability is built, not announced. I didn't come from influence. I came from discipline. From learning how to listen before speaking. From understanding that results matter more than personality. In every role I held, I did the same thing. I learned the rhythm. I found the weak points. I strengthened them without needing credit. That's how I ended up in that office. Suburban building. Neutral colors. Glass walls meant to suggest transparency. It was the kind of place where people talked about values more than they practiced them. Still, I respected the structure. Respect doesn't require illusion. My wife worked there too, in a different department. That wasn't planned. It just happened over time. We kept our lives separate at work. No favoritism. No overlap. Two professionals sharing a building. Nothing more. People knew we were married. They didn't know us. At home, life was calm. Predictable in the best way. Morning routines. Shared dinners. Walks without urgency. We talked about the future carefully, not because we were afraid of it, but because we valued it. When we learned about the pregnancy, we chose patience. Early joy is fragile. We wanted to protect it from noise. German became our shelter. Not secrecy. Shelter. A language tied to study, effort, and respect. We never used it to exclude. Only to preserve something private in a place that rewarded exposure. At work, my reputation was steady. Not loud. Reliable. I was the person people came to when something broke quietly and needed to be fixed without escalation. Leadership liked outcomes, even if they didn't always like the process that produced them. That's important to understand. I wasn't expendable. But I also wasn't protected. I occupied that dangerous middle ground where competence is assumed and loyalty is tested. The director arrived 2 years before everything changed. Charismatic. Educated. Fluent in several languages, or so he implied. He liked appearing worldly. It gave him authority without effort. People deferred to him quickly. He understood presentation. From the beginning, his leadership style was indirect. He preferred influence over instruction, suggestion over accountability. It worked because most people don't question tone when it sounds confident. I noticed it. I didn't challenge it. Not my role. My wife noticed something else. He listened more than he spoke. Not attentively. Selectively. He collected information. Preferences. Weaknesses. That's not illegal. But it's not accidental either. When the pregnancy conversations happened, we didn't think of him. We thought of safety. We thought of time. We thought of the possibility that joy could be disrupted if exposed too early. We underestimated curiosity paired with power. Once you understand that, the rest makes sense. When leadership learned what they weren't meant to hear, they didn't ask questions. They didn't check assumptions. They moved directly to calculation. What would this mean for availability? For focus? For timelines? No one asked us. That's the injustice at the center of this story. Decisions were made about our lives without our consent, using information taken without permission. Everything else flowed from that moment. People often imagine betrayal as emotional, loud, personal. This one wasn't. It was administrative, polite, smiling. That makes it harder to fight and easier to deny. I didn't know then how far it would go. I only knew that something had shifted. The ground felt different. Not unstable. Remeasured. I adjusted without announcing it. I paid closer attention to language, to phrasing, to who documented and who didn't. I noticed how policy was referenced when convenient and ignored when it wasn't. At home, My wife asked if we should say something. Clarify. I told her not yet. Explanation too early looks like permission. We needed understanding first. Understanding is slower than reaction, but it lasts longer. This part of the story matters because it explains why I didn't explode when the betrayal surfaced. I had already learned something essential long before that meeting. People reveal their values when they believe they're unseen. I had seen enough. The setup wasn't dramatic. That's why it worked. Systems rarely break loudly. They bend quietly until someone decides to stop bending with them. I didn't decide that yet. But I was close. The unfairness sharpened when I realized effort no longer mattered, only perception did. Before the betrayal showed its face, there were signs. They were easy to ignore if you wanted comfort. Harder to dismiss if you paid attention. I paid attention. Meetings changed tone first. Not content. Tone. Questions once asked openly were now redirected. Suggestions I made were repeated later by someone else, with better timing and louder confidence. Credit shifted hands quietly. That's how environments prepare for exclusion. They rewrite memory before they rewrite roles. I didn't confront it. Confrontation feeds performance. Instead, I watched who benefited and who disappeared from conversations. Patterns don't lie when you give them time. My wife noticed similar shifts upstairs. Her manager started attending meetings she'd never attended before. Sitting in the corner. Listening. Writing nothing. Power observes before it acts. She felt evaluated without criteria. That kind of attention drains you faster than criticism. We compared notes at night, not to complain, but to understand. Our conversations weren't emotional. They were analytical. We spoke like people mapping terrain before a storm. The director's influence spread through subtle permission. Certain behaviors were rewarded. Others ignored. People learned quickly what tone to adopt. Agreeable. Flexible. Uncomplicated. The ones who questioned timelines or raised ethical concerns found themselves sidelined from strategic discussions. That's when I realized something important. This wasn't personal yet. It was cultural. And cultures don't correct themselves. I adjusted my behavior slightly. I spoke less in meetings. I sent follow-ups instead. Written words age better than spoken ones. I made sure my contributions were traceable. Not defensive. Just clear. At the same time, I noticed how language was used as leverage. Words like commitment and availability appeared more often. They were never defined. Ambiguity gives authority room to move. One afternoon, a colleague asked me if everything was okay. His voice was careful. I told him yes. He nodded but didn't look convinced. Rumors had started moving without names attached. That's another sign. When stories travel faster than facts. My wife received an invitation to an informal check-in. No agenda. Just a conversation. She asked me what I thought. I told her to listen more than she spoke. That advice has never failed me. She returned calm but alert. They had asked about her future plans. About balance. About support systems. She answered professionally. She didn't volunteer anything. They didn't press. They took notes. Notes matter. At work, I was asked to mentor someone new. Capable. Ambitious. Friendly. The kind of assignment that looks generous but serves another purpose. Knowledge transfer without acknowledgement. I agreed. Refusal would have been noted. I taught carefully. Process, not shortcuts. Structure, not tricks. I made sure everything I shared was already documented somewhere official. Quiet protection. The director praised collaboration in a town hall meeting. He spoke about adaptability. About how strong teams anticipate change. He didn't look at me, but he didn't have to. Messages don't need eye contact to land. After the meeting, HR sent out a reminder about performance metrics. Neutral. Broad. Timed perfectly. Systems like to appear impartial when pressure increases. At home, my wife asked again if we should disclose the pregnancy officially. I said not yet. Disclosure shifts leverage. Once information is out, you can't control how it's used. We waited. Waiting wasn't passive. It was active restraint. I reviewed company policy that weekend. Not obsessively. Thoroughly. Family leave. Anti-discrimination clauses. Reporting structures. I wasn't looking for weapons. I was learning the language the system respected. Monday arrived quietly. The director scheduled a leadership sync. I wasn't invited. That was new. The meeting summary arrived afterward with decisions already made. I read it twice. The omissions were louder than the content. That night, I told my wife something I hadn't said out loud before. They're preparing the ground. She understood immediately. Preparation doesn't always mean action. Sometimes it means creating an environment where action looks justified later. I recognized the shape of it from earlier years, from places where power disguised itself as process. I didn't feel defeated. I felt informed. Information changes how you stand. The setup was almost complete now. Roles were shifting. Narratives were forming. Silence was being interpreted as compliance. That assumption would cost them. But not yet. Not until the moment was right. The injustice crossed a line when preparation turned into permission. By the time I felt it clearly, the groundwork had already been laid. Roles were being redefined without discussion. Authority was being exercised without accountability. And silence, my silence, was being read as acceptance. That misunderstanding would become their greatest error. The director began delegating through intermediaries. Instructions arrived filtered, softened, stripped of context. If something failed, responsibility became blurry. If something worked, credit traveled upward quickly. I watched the flow carefully. Power prefers distance when it anticipates conflict. One morning, a calendar invite appeared for a strategic alignment meeting. Mandatory. Short notice. I knew what that meant. Alignment is rarely about ideas. It's about positioning. In the room, familiar faces avoided each other's eyes. The director spoke confidently about upcoming changes. He framed them as growth, opportunity, streamlining. No one asked questions. Not because they agreed, but because agreement was safer than curiosity. When my turn came, I was asked how flexible I felt about shifting responsibilities. I answered honestly. I said flexibility works best when expectations are clear. I said clarity protects teams. I said nothing about myself. That unsettled him. After the meeting, an email summarized the discussion. My comments were paraphrased inaccurately. Subtle changes. Enough to change meaning without appearing dishonest. I replied with a correction. Polite. Precise. The thread went quiet. That afternoon, my wife called me from a stairwell. Her voice was steady, but she didn't waste words. Her manager had suggested she consider reducing future commitments for balance. No timeline. No policy reference. Just implication. That was permission. Permission to interfere. Permission to assume. Permission to plan our lives for us. I asked her what she had said. She told me she thanked them for the concern and asked for clarification in writing. There was none. Only reassurance. Reassurance is often used when someone doesn't want a record. At home that evening, we sat at the table longer than usual. No phones. No distractions. We talked about boundaries. About what we would accept and what we wouldn't. We agreed on one thing completely. We would not explain ourselves to people who had already decided. That weekend, I reviewed my work history again. Projects delivered. Metrics exceeded. Feedback archived. Not to prove my worth. To understand leverage. Quiet revenge begins with knowing where you stand without asking permission. Monday arrived with a different energy. The director was distant. Efficient. He avoided unnecessary conversation. That's how people behave when they believe the outcome is already decided. In the afternoon, HR requested a brief check-in. Optional, they said. Nothing is optional when HR calls. The conversation was cordial, neutral. They asked how I felt about recent changes. I said I was adapting. They asked if anything outside work might affect my focus. I paused before answering. I said my focus was strong. I didn't volunteer anything else. They nodded, satisfied, and reminded me that the company valued transparency. Transparency is often requested when someone already has information they didn't earn. When the call ended, I understood something fully for the first time. This was no longer about performance or planning. It was about control. Control disguised as concern. That night, my wife and I took a walk through our neighborhood. Houses lit warmly. Lawns trimmed carefully. Everything looked stable from the outside. That contrast mattered. Systems fail quietly in places that look calm. She asked me if this would end badly. I told her the truth. It will end clearly. Clarity is not always kind, but it is fair. I didn't know yet how the story would resolve. I only knew that the next phase would not be subtle. Preparation had turned into action. Observation into interference. The line had been crossed. I went to bed that night with a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. Not relief. Readiness. Because once injustice becomes deliberate, silence is no longer passive. It becomes strategy. The conflict became unavoidable when they tried to make my silence look like guilt. It started subtly, the way these things always do. A question asked in the wrong tone. A pause held a second too long. Silence reinterpreted by people who needed it to mean something else. They weren't confronting me. They were framing me. The first sign was an email copied wider than necessary. A minor issue, already resolved, presented as a concern about judgment. The language was careful. The implication wasn't. I replied with facts only. Timeline. Resolution. Documentation attached. No emotion. Facts don't argue. They wait. Still, the pattern continued. Meetings where my name appeared without context. Conversations where my absence did the talking for me. When people want a narrative, they create gaps so imagination can work for them. The director stopped speaking to me directly. Instructions came through others. Feedback arrived filtered. That distance wasn't avoidance. It was positioning. If things escalated, he wanted to look uninvolved. My wife felt it too. Her workload shifted unpredictably. Projects reassigned without explanation. She wasn't criticized. She was sidelined. Marginalization is quieter than accusation and harder to prove. One afternoon, she was asked to step into a temporary support role. No timeline. No recognition. Just helping where needed. She accepted professionally. Declining would have raised questions. Compliance was expected. That night, she asked me if this was what pressure felt like. I told her yes. Pressure isn't loud. It's persistent. It pushes until you lean without noticing. At work, a review meeting was scheduled. Performance check-in. Routine, they said. HR attended. The director joined remotely. Cameras on. Smiles prepared. They spoke about collaboration challenges. About adaptability. About communication styles. Nothing specific. That's how you accuse without accusing. I listened. Took notes. Let them finish. Then I asked for examples. Silence. Examples require accountability. They offered generalities instead. I asked again, calmly. HR shifted in their seat. The director cleared his throat. He said he would follow up with details later. I thanked him. After the call, a colleague messaged me privately. He said things were being said. He didn't specify what. He didn't need to. Vagueness protects messengers. I didn't defend myself. Defense accepts the premise. I continued documenting. A week later, a decision landed without discussion. A project milestone was delayed. Responsibility was assigned to my team publicly, though dependencies had failed elsewhere. The message went out company-wide. That was humiliation. Not loud. Not aggressive. Strategic. I corrected the record privately first. No response. Then publicly, with data. Neutral language. Shared ownership. The truth has a way of standing out when it's calm. The director replied thanking everyone for flexibility. He didn't acknowledge the correction. That was another choice. At home, my wife was quieter than usual. She said she felt watched. Evaluated for things she hadn't done. I listened. I didn't reassure her with false certainty. I told her we would stay precise. Precision protects people better than optimism. The next escalation came disguised as opportunity. A temporary role change. Increased visibility. More responsibility. No additional authority. No compensation. Just exposure. I recognized the tactic. If I failed, it would confirm their narrative. If I succeeded, they would claim alignment. I accepted. Success under scrutiny changes the balance. I delivered early, clean, documented, cross-validated. I made it impossible to question outcomes without questioning process. The director congratulated the team. He didn't mention my name. That omission was noticed. People started watching more closely. When conflict becomes visible, neutrality dissolves. HR requested another conversation. This time, they asked directly about stress. About personal distractions. I answered calmly. I said my performance metrics were stable. I asked if there were concerns. They said no. That was the problem. If there were no concerns, then pressure had no justification. If pressure continued, it would expose intent. I could feel the tension tightening, like a wire pulled too far. They wanted a reaction. Something emotional. Something careless. They didn't get it. Instead, they made a mistake. A small one, but enough. And once mistakes are documented, they don't disappear. The rising conflict had begun its real work. The humiliation became deliberate when they decided pressure was safer than truth. Once the first mistake was made, everything accelerated. Not because they were confident, but because they were nervous. Nervous systems rush. They compress time. They repeat tactics that once worked and hope volume replaces logic. The director began scheduling overlapping deadlines. Projects that had never conflicted suddenly did. Priorities shifted without notice, then shifted back. When I asked for clarification, I was told to use judgment. Judgment without authority is a trap. In meetings, my contributions were acknowledged vaguely. Good point, without reference. We'll take that offline, without follow-up. My presence was tolerated, not welcomed. That's how organizations prepare to distance themselves. Then came the public review. A quarterly update. Large group. Leadership present. The kind of forum where reputations are adjusted quietly but permanently. My team's work was summarized quickly. Key risks were highlighted without context. Dependencies were omitted. The room absorbed the message exactly as intended. I felt the weight of it in the silence afterward. No questions. No clarifications. Just polite movement to the next agenda item. That was humiliation. I didn't respond immediately. Reaction would have looked defensive. Instead, I sent a follow-up later that day. Clear data. Shared responsibility. Neutral tone. I CC'd only those who mattered. The reply came from HR, not the director. They thanked me for the clarification and said they would factor it into future evaluations. Evaluations. Plural. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. At home, my wife told me she had been excluded from a planning meeting she usually led. No explanation. When she asked afterward, she was told the meeting had been moved last minute. Calendar logs told a different story. Exclusion is easier to deny than accusation. She asked me if we should start preparing for something worse. I told her we already were. Preparation doesn't always look like movement. Sometimes it looks like stillness with intent. The next escalation came through paperwork. A formal performance improvement plan was mentioned casually in conversation. Not issued. Mentioned. A warning shot. Enough to create anxiety without triggering review mechanisms. I asked for clarification in writing. There was none. Silence again. Silence used as pressure. I responded by requesting clear criteria for success on current projects. Measurable. Time-bound. Documented. That request alone changed behavior. You can't threaten ambiguity when someone demands structure. The director avoided me for days after that. Communication flowed through intermediaries again. HR became more visible. Present in meetings. Watching. Taking notes. Protecting process, not people. Then they tried something riskier. A complaint appeared. Anonymous. Vague. About communication style. About tone. No incidents. No dates. Just impressions. HR informed me neutrally. They said it wasn't disciplinary. Just informational. That's how reputations are damaged quietly. I asked for specifics. None were provided. I asked how to respond. I was told no response was necessary. I documented the conversation immediately. At that point, I understood the shape of the conflict fully. They weren't trying to correct behavior. They were creating a file. Files don't need truth. They need accumulation. That night, I told my wife something I hadn't admitted before. They want me to break. She didn't argue. She asked how. I said by reacting. By defending emotionally. By making one mistake they could point to later. She asked what I would do instead. I told her I would become boring. Predictable. Documented. Unremarkable. That's harder to attack. The next weeks were exhausting by design. Constant check-ins. Shifting expectations. Friendly reminders about alignment. I met every requirement precisely. Nothing extra. Nothing missing. Precision became my shield. People started noticing the imbalance. Noticing who was calm and who was pushing. Conflict reveals character over time. The director's tone grew sharper in meetings. He interrupted more. Corrected others unnecessarily. Pressure leaks through behavior. Then came another mistake. Small again, but connected to the first. Patterns form whether people intend them to or not. I saw the line clearly now. All that remained was patience. And patience, when combined with records, is dangerous. The conflict was rising toward something it could no longer contain. The conflict reached its peak when they tried to force a mistake that didn't exist. Pressure changes people. It reveals impatience, ego, and fear. By this point, all three were visible. Meetings grew shorter. Decisions came faster. The director stopped waiting for consensus. He wanted closure. Control always wants an ending. The attempt came disguised as urgency. A critical deadline was moved forward without notice. Dependencies were ignored. Resources reassigned. The expectation was clear: deliver anyway, then fail publicly. Failure would justify everything they had been preparing. I saw it immediately. I responded the only way that didn't give them what they wanted. I acknowledged the deadline. I outlined risks in writing. I requested confirmation. Professional. Clear. No confirmation came. Instead, a message arrived stating that leadership trusted my judgment. Trust without authority is abandonment. I proceeded carefully. I documented every constraint. I flagged every dependency. I delivered what was possible and clearly marked what wasn't. Nothing hidden. Nothing rushed. Precision again. The presentation day arrived. Large room. Senior leadership present. The director sat at the table this time, confident, expectant. I walked through the work methodically. No defense. No excuses. Just sequence, data, and limits. When questions came, I answered directly. When gaps were mentioned, I referenced prior emails. Dates. Times. Requests unanswered. The room shifted. Not dramatically. Subtly. Attention moved away from me and toward the process. The director interrupted once. He tried to reframe the delay as resistance. I didn't argue. I read his own message aloud. The one where trust had replaced confirmation. Silence followed. Silence is dangerous in rooms like that. The meeting ended without conclusion. Leadership thanked everyone and said they would follow up. The director avoided eye contact as people stood. That afternoon, HR requested an immediate conversation. Urgent, they said. The tone was different this time. Less procedural. More careful. They asked about the deadline change. About communication. About expectations. I answered with records. Nothing else. They asked if I felt targeted. I paused. I said I felt observed. That answer mattered. Because observation implies responsibility. Later that day, my wife received an email reversing a previous exclusion. She was invited back into planning discussions. No explanation. No apology. Just access restored. That wasn't kindness. That was adjustment. At home, we talked quietly. We knew something had shifted. The pressure hadn't disappeared, but it had lost direction. When tactics fail, power hesitates. The director sent a message late that evening. Brief. Neutral. He thanked me for navigating a challenging situation. No admission. No ownership. I replied with thanks and documentation. That was the last time he tried to corner me directly. The rising conflict had reached its limit. They could no longer escalate without exposing themselves. Every move now required justification. I didn't feel relief. I felt balance. Because conflict doesn't resolve when someone wins loudly. It resolves when pressure meets clarity. The next phase wouldn't be about survival. It would be about consequence. And consequences, when allowed to arrive on their own, are quieter than revenge. The turning point was close. The reversal began the moment they realized control had quietly left their hands. Power rarely announces when it slips. It changes posture first. Voices soften. Decisions slow. People who once spoke with certainty begin asking for alignment. That's how I knew the balance had shifted. After the failed attempt to force a mistake, the office settled into an unfamiliar calm. Not peace. Caution. Meetings were rescheduled instead of rushed. Emails included more people than necessary. Words like confirm, review, and document appeared everywhere. They were no longer managing outcomes. They were managing risk. The director stopped improvising. He arrived prepared. Over-prepared. Agendas became detailed. Questions were rehearsed. He avoided informal conversations and kept doors open when he spoke to anyone alone. Power does that when it feels watched. HR followed the same pattern. Their messages were slower, more careful, less suggestive. They stopped hinting and started asking. That distinction matters. Hints pressure. Questions record. I answered every question calmly, briefly, with attachments. Nothing more. My role stabilized almost overnight. Responsibilities that had been drifting returned clearly defined. Deadlines were negotiated again instead of imposed. When changes were proposed, they came with explanations. That wasn't generosity. That was correction. At the same time, my wife's environment shifted too. Meetings resumed with her included. Her input was requested again. Not praised. Requested. That's how organizations acknowledge error without admitting it. We didn't celebrate. We observed. Because turning points are fragile. Move too fast, and you reveal intent. Move too slow, and momentum fades. I chose consistency. The compliance review timeline advanced quietly. No announcements. Just calendar blocks appearing across leadership schedules. Names attached. External advisors included. That detail mattered most. External eyes change behavior instantly. The director grew distant. Not hostile. Careful. He delegated authority he once kept close. He stopped speaking about long-term plans publicly. Vision becomes dangerous when the present is under scrutiny. I was asked to provide historical documentation for a project I had led years earlier. The request came politely, framed as routine. I complied fully. Complete records. Clear timelines. Nothing hidden. That request wasn't about the project. It was about patterns. I could see the shape of what was happening now. The system was reviewing itself, and in doing so, it was comparing stories. My story hadn't changed. Theirs had. One afternoon, a senior executive I had never worked with directly asked for a brief conversation. No agenda. No preface. Just a time. We spoke about process. About decision-making under pressure. About how misunderstandings escalate when documentation is inconsistent. He listened more than he spoke. That told me everything. He didn't ask about blame. He asked about sequence. Sequence reveals responsibility without accusation. After that call, the director canceled a meeting he had scheduled with me earlier that week. No explanation. It wasn't needed. At home, my wife asked if this was the turning point. I told her it was the beginning of one. Turning points don't arrive loudly. They arrive when the other side stops pushing. I didn't feel victorious. I felt lighter. Because when pressure lifts, you realize how much weight you were carrying just to remain still. The next steps wouldn't involve confrontation. They would involve contrast. And contrast, when allowed to speak for itself, is the quietest form of revenge. The first consequence appeared the moment their narratives began to unravel. It was subtle, almost invisible. A missed reference in a meeting, a date misquoted in an email, a timeline that contradicted earlier statements. Small mistakes, insignificant alone, but together they told a story the leadership hadn't expected. I noticed immediately. Every record I maintained lined up perfectly. Every note, every attachment, every timeline confirmed the reality of what had occurred. Their version of events began to falter under scrutiny. The director tried to reassert authority by calling a quick strategy session. Invitations went out. Agendas were prepared. Confidence was rehearsed. Yet, during the session, facts began to surface that contradicted his framing. People noticed. Whispers followed. HR, previously silent, asked for clarification on project responsibilities. The questions were neutral but firm. Documentation was requested. Requests were ignored before. Now they required answers. That shift changed the room's dynamics. Control was slipping. My team delivered their updates as I had instructed. Calm, accurate, traceable. Every metric referenced, every dependency accounted for. The contrast was clear. Where the system had previously bent under misrepresentation, it now demanded consistency. The director paused, rephrased, hesitated. The room felt it. When your authority is silently questioned, even the strongest demeanor cracks. Later that week, my wife noticed her manager was no longer micromanaging projects or questioning future commitments. Policies that had been suggested as flexible were now enforced consistently. The system was correcting itself. That wasn't luck. That was inevitable once structure, accuracy, and consistency outweighed manipulation and assumption. The director sent a brief follow-up email after one meeting. Neutral in tone. Corrective but cautious. He didn't assert vision. He acknowledged facts. Facts that had already been documented. Facts that could not be disputed. The ripple spread. Colleagues started relying on documented processes rather than whispers. Decisions required clarity. Authority needed transparency. Subtle accountability emerged organically. At home, my wife remarked quietly, "They're starting to realize their errors without being told." Exactly. That's the moment quiet revenge begins. When patience, precision, and restraint allow the system itself to enact correction. I didn't intervene. I didn't escalate. I only ensured that everything was recorded, consistent, and undeniable. My calm became the contrast to their escalating missteps. By the end of the week, leadership communication had changed. Requests for justification increased. Informal assumptions disappeared. Authority had to conform to reality, not perception. I watched it unfold silently, knowing that control had shifted without a word being raised. They had created the conditions for their own correction. And in that quiet space, I realized the true power of patient observation. When people try to manipulate the system for advantage, the system, once aligned with truth, becomes the most effective agent of consequence. The turning point was in motion, and the resolution was waiting, patient as ever. The turning point became undeniable when their own actions forced clarity. The director, once confident in ambiguity, began double-checking messages, hesitating before assigning tasks. Every instruction now required validation, and every decision risked exposure. Control had slipped quietly, almost invisibly, but the effect was profound. I continued my work methodically, with precision and documentation. Every project, every metric, every communication was traceable. No emotion. No confrontation. Just the unassailable record of what had occurred. HR, now aligned with facts rather than perception, began requesting clarifications that revealed inconsistencies. Policies previously ignored were now enforced evenly. Actions once framed as flexible were now codified. Authority had to conform to truth. The team noticed. Their confidence in me grew, quietly. The contrast between calm, documented performance and anxious, reactive leadership was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, the director requested a follow-up on a past project. Dates, deliverables, approvals, all were presented in a single thread, organized, factual, and clear. There was nothing left to question, only to acknowledge. He didn't respond with the force he once used. He simply noted receipt and moved on. That moment crystallized everything. Their pressure, their manipulation, and their attempts at control had become ineffective. At home, my wife and I reflected without celebration. We observed the subtle shifts in power, the way systems corrected themselves when truth and patience aligned. We knew the conflict had passed its peak and the consequences were naturally unfolding. The director's tone in subsequent meetings softened. Caution replaced urgency. Assumptions replaced by questions. Silence was no longer misread as compliance. It was recognized as awareness. The system had responded. The imbalance had corrected itself. Quiet revenge had worked, not through confrontation, not through anger, but through accuracy, patience, and consistency. And in that calm, reflective space, I understood something essential. Power loses its weight when it is measured against unshakable truth. The turning point was complete. And the resolution, the natural consequence of clarity and integrity, was waiting just ahead. Justice arrived quietly, without confrontation, as the system began correcting itself. The first sign was procedural. Deadlines were aligned, responsibilities clarified. No announcements. No declarations. The change was functional, not theatrical. Accuracy replaced assumption. Tasks that once drifted without notice now had defined owners, and inconsistencies that once favored manipulation were no longer tolerated. I continued documenting everything. Every email. Every meeting summary. Every instruction. Calmly. Consistently. Facts become instruments when wielded without emotion, and systems respond more faithfully to truth than to complaint. The director noticed. I could see it in the small shifts, the careful phrasing, the avoidance of overstatement, the reliance on documented evidence rather than conjecture. Authority adjusts when it feels observed. The first cracks in overconfidence appear subtly, but they widen steadily. HR began consulting directly with project teams rather than relying solely on leadership interpretation. Policies were enforced evenly. Actions taken without oversight were flagged. People were required to justify deviations. Their previous comfort in shaping narratives had evaporated. My wife's environment normalized. Projects she led were acknowledged in official summaries. Decisions she influenced were cited in reports. No apology came. None was needed. Systems don't reward admission, they reward accuracy. Her presence restored was recognition in itself. Colleagues who had witnessed the previous imbalance began speaking more openly. Documentation provided them clarity. No assumptions. No rumors. Nothing remained vague. Confidence returned quietly, with trust in process rather than personalities. I didn't act. I only ensured clarity. Accuracy did the rest. Leadership missteps corrected themselves when aligned against the truth. Patterns that once worked in their favor now exposed error. A meeting was called to review past projects. Data, timelines, emails, all presented in organized threads. The discrepancies became evident. Leadership could no longer claim perception or interpretation. The system itself demanded acknowledgement. No one needed to shout. No one needed to accuse. Observers simply noted the facts, and the facts spoke for themselves. That evening, my wife and I sat quietly over coffee. She remarked, "It's almost poetic, how the truth unfolds without us raising our voices." I nodded. It's always quieter, more effective. When justice isn't demanded, it is allowed to arrive naturally. The first stage of resolution was complete. The pressure that had been applied through manipulation and assumption had dissolved, replaced by clarity, structure, and fairness. And in that calm, deliberate space, I realized the true essence of quiet revenge. It is not loud. It does not humiliate. It allows the system to correct itself, revealing error without ever needing to strike. Balance became apparent when others began seeing clarity instead of authority. The atmosphere in the office shifted quietly. Meetings became structured, deadlines reasonable, responsibilities clear. People began relying on facts rather than speculation, and the culture of subtle manipulation began to fade. Authority no longer dictated outcomes. It responded to reality. I continued my work methodically. Every instruction, every update, every deliverable was documented. I did not flaunt it, nor did I complain. I simply ensured that clarity was undeniable, accessible, and traceable. Others noticed the difference in approach, even if they didn't articulate it. Colleagues who had previously relied on rumor or assumption began presenting their work with documentation, referencing data, and confirming decisions in writing. Patterns shifted because the system responded to accuracy, not influence. Their respect for process quietly grew, and the perception of my competence became irrefutable. The director adjusted. He consulted, rather than dictated. He asked questions rather than assumed. Emails became precise, calendars transparent, and the subtle pressure that had once filled every corner of the office diminished. The narrative could no longer be controlled by incomplete information. HR meetings transitioned from subtle admonitions to structured guidance. Policies were applied consistently. Observations were factual, not speculative. Systems now functioned as designed, rather than as tools for influence. At home, my wife's professional standing was restored entirely. Projects she led were recognized, credit documented, and her input sought in strategy discussions. There was no fanfare, no acknowledgement from those who had caused the imbalance. But that acknowledgement was unnecessary. Fairness had arrived quietly and effectively. I noticed how others responded to the change. Team members began communicating openly, asking questions they had previously withheld. The culture of fear and avoidance dissolved, replaced by collaboration grounded in clarity and accountability. Tension eased without confrontation. One afternoon, the director asked for a follow-up discussion. His tone was careful, deliberate, almost humble. He sought clarity rather than influence. I provided documentation and explained process. He listened. He didn't challenge. The dynamic had shifted. The balance had corrected itself without a single argument. The system now enforced fairness because facts outweighed assumption. Leadership's missteps, previously hidden by ambiguity, were now transparent and addressed naturally. We observed without celebration. No one shouted. No one was humiliated. The correction was self-evident, and the quiet resolution proved more satisfying than any dramatic victory. And in that moment, I understood fully. True resolution does not demand attention or applause. It arrives with patience, clarity, and moral consistency. The narrative is corrected, and the injustice, once persistent, no longer holds sway. The final correction became apparent when fairness replaced assumption entirely. By now, patterns had shifted. Deadlines, responsibilities, and accountability were all clear. The office operated on documentation rather than interpretation. People no longer speculated, they relied on verified information. The culture of subtle manipulation had disappeared almost entirely. The director communicated cautiously, measured, and factually. Decisions were documented. Approvals were transparent. Ambiguity, once a tool for control, had no leverage left. Even casual remarks were checked against prior records. Leadership could no longer shape perception through omission or implication. HR enforced policies consistently. Requests for clarification were routine and neutral. Feedback was structured and evidence-based. The system no longer tolerated manipulation disguised as guidance. Every action had accountability attached. My team operated confidently. Their work was precise, documented, and verified. Collaboration returned. Rumors faded. The office had returned to equilibrium, a quiet environment where competence and fairness determined outcomes, not whispered agendas. At home, my wife's career trajectory had returned to normal. Meetings she led were attended and respected. Her contributions were referenced in reports and summaries. There was no fanfare, no apologies. The correction was effective without spectacle. Justice arrived silently but completely. Colleagues expressed relief without comment. Confidence and trust had returned organically. They no longer feared subtle reprimand or hidden agendas. The workplace had become functional, fair, and predictable. I maintained calm throughout, never raising my voice, never seeking credit. The record, accuracy, and clarity had done the work. Injustice had been corrected naturally, and the imbalance had been restored without dramatic confrontation. The final piece of the resolution was not about victory. It was about peace. Observation, patience, and methodical accuracy allowed the system to enforce fairness. Nothing else was needed. And in that quiet restoration, I realized the core principle of moral revenge. When the system is given clarity, justice will arrive without force, and wrongdoing corrects itself under the weight of truth. The story ended not with anger, but with reflection. In the days following the resolution, I watched how quiet patience and consistent truth reshaped the environment. The office operated smoothly. Colleagues collaborated openly. Leadership exercised authority thoughtfully. Every correction had been enacted by the system itself, guided by clarity and record, not by confrontation or drama. At home, my wife and I returned to routines with a sense of calm. Discussions about professional pressures became thoughtful reflections rather than complaints. We recognized the subtle ways patience, observation, and measured action had protected us. No revenge had been loud. No spectacle had occurred. The lesson was evident in the restored balance around us. I reflected on the nature of injustice. It does not always announce itself. It appears in subtle manipulations, in ambiguity, in assumptions that go unchallenged. And correction does not always require confrontation. It requires clarity, consistency, and the courage to maintain integrity while waiting for the truth to assert itself. People often ask why I didn't respond angrily, why I didn't escalate immediately. The answer is simple. Reaction validates the assumption of guilt. Patience preserves agency. Observation protects integrity. Facts, when allowed to speak, create their own resolution. And justice, when it is allowed to arrive naturally, is far more satisfying than any revenge enacted in haste. We also recognize the value of maintaining meticulous records and clear communication. These are not tools of paranoia. They are shields against misunderstanding. They protect professional and personal life alike, ensuring that when the moment of consequence arrives, it arrives accurately, without exaggeration or distortion. The office slowly returned to a rhythm that was steady and predictable. Missteps were corrected without public blame, and recognition for work done was given appropriately. People learned quietly that systems respond to clarity and consistency rather than manipulation or impatience. That lesson resonated beyond the workplace, influencing interactions at home and in the broader community. The calm revenge, though invisible to many, had succeeded. The balance of fairness, accountability, and respect was restored. And in that quiet restoration, I understood one enduring truth. Sometimes silence is the most effective form of justice, and patience the most powerful form of revenge. Peace settled where tension once ruled. In the weeks that followed, I noticed subtle changes in behavior around the office. Conversations were more transparent, requests were clarified, and decisions were documented carefully. Leadership, once confident in manipulating perception, now acted cautiously, aware that truth was both visible and unassailable. The lessons they had learned silently influenced the culture without any confrontation. My wife thrived in her role. Her input was respected. Her projects were recognized. No grand acknowledgement was required. The system now rewarded competence and clarity naturally. Observing her confidence grow reminded me that patience and calm integrity protect more than aggression ever could. At home, our conversations became reflective. We spoke about choices, about moments when restraint mattered more than reaction, and about how understanding the mechanisms of pressure allowed us to navigate injustice without losing composure. We realized that silence is not passivity. Silence, when paired with preparation, documentation, and reflection, becomes a force stronger than anger. I thought about colleagues who had witnessed the rise and fall of pressure tactics. They adapted to clarity and structure. The office learned to operate based on facts and process rather than rumor, suggestion, or implicit manipulation. People started trusting systems, trusting transparency, trusting integrity. And in that quiet trust, I saw the ultimate lesson unfold. Fairness doesn't require dramatics, it requires consistency. Even the director, once assertive and unchallenged, adjusted naturally. He relied on verified information, communicated cautiously, and began fostering collaboration over dominance. The correction had arrived not through public exposure, but through internal acknowledgement and the invisible weight of facts. As I reflected, I understood the broader implication. The most enduring form of revenge isn't about punishment or humiliation. It's about allowing truth to guide outcomes, ensuring integrity is maintained, and demonstrating that patience and precision are more effective than confrontation. Justice, when aligned with moral patience, becomes inevitable. In those quiet moments, with the office balanced and home life calm, I realized the final truth of this journey. The world does not always reward haste, anger, or impulsive retaliation. It rewards clarity, reflection, and the careful preservation of truth. And in that awareness, we found lasting peace.